Hey guys, tonight we are setting sail on the high seas of history, not in search of buried treasure, but to uncover some rather surprising truths about the personal habits of those legendary terrors of the Caribbean, the Golden Age pirates. Imagine the creak of timbers, the scent of salt spray mixed with tar, and something vaguely fishy, the glint of a cutlass in the tropical sun. You probably picture a grizzled figure with a tangled beard, a stained bandana, and maybe a parrot squawking about pieces of eight. And let's be honest, personal hygiene probably isn't the first thing that springs to mind. In fact, with our modern standards of cleanliness and a distinct aversion to things like scurvy and sharing our living space with rats the size of small cats, you probably wouldn't survive a week on one of their ships. Or maybe even a day if the latrine situation was particularly dire. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, maybe drop a comment to let us know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always a thrill to see our global crew of history enthusiasts and sleepy scholars tuning in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're stepping very carefully onto the weathered deck of a pirate vessel somewhere in the sun-drenched Caribbean, say around the year 1715. This is the heart of the golden age of piracy, a period roughly spanning from the 1650s to the 1730s, though its most notorious Caribbean chapter flares brightest between the 1690s and the early 1720s. Thousands of men and a few surprisingly daring women turned to this life driven by a potent cocktail of desperation, dreams of plunder, a desire for a peculiar sort of freedom, and a hearty rebellion against the often brutal imperial powers and merchant companies of the day. The air is thick with the smell of damp wood, bilgewater, sweat, and perhaps a hint of rum. The sounds are a symphony of the sea. The groan of the ship's structure, the snap of canvas sails, the distant cries of gulls, and the rough laughter of the crew. Your first instinct, conditioned by centuries of books and movies, might be to hold your nose to recoil from an overwhelming wave of human grime. We picture pirates as universally filthy, their clothes caked with goodness knows what, their hair crawling with lice their teeth. Well, let's not even go there just yet. And certainly life aboard a cramped, constantly damp, and often dangerously unhygienic sailing ship was no walk in a perfumed garden. They weren't exactly booking seaweed wraps and aromatherapy massages during their downtime. Let's be clear. Fresh water was often more precious than gold for drinking, let alone for extensive bathing. Disease was rampant, and medical care was rudimentary at best. Yet, as you look a little closer beyond the immediate, rugged first impression, you might start to notice little things, subtle contradictions to the enduring myth of the utterly squalid buccaneer. Perhaps you see a fellow trying to mend a tear in his shirt with a clumsy needle and thread, or another attempting to coax some order into his salt-stiffened beard with a crudely carved wooden comb. You might even spot a grizzled old salt vigorously scrubbing a patch of his weathered trousers with a piece of holy stone, normally used for scouring the wooden decks a telltale white. A desperate, focused attempt to remove some unidentifiable but undoubtedly offensive stain. Not exactly bespoke tailoring or a trip to the laundromat, but it's an effort, isn't it? A for effort, at least. Historians still debate whether the popular, almost cartoonish image of the perpetually filthy and unkempt pirate is an accurate reflection of the average buccaneer during the Golden Age, or largely an exaggeration perpetuated by sensationalist contemporary accounts, often written by their enemies or captives, and of course greatly embellished by later fiction. The truth, as it so often is, likely lies somewhere in the messy, fascinating middle. These were hardened individuals, certainly living a life of extreme peril and often extreme discomfort. But they were also human. They experienced pride, vanity, and the very practical need to avoid being so utterly repulsive that even their own crewmates gave them a wide berth. Consider the practicalities. Too much filth could lead to sores infections and an even greater infestation of lice and fleas than was already inevitable. In a hot, humid climate, skin conditions could quickly become debilitating. And while their understanding of germ theory was, shall we say, non-existent, they would have certainly understood cause and effect on a basic level. If you let a wound fester, uncared for, bad things happened. Some pirate articles, those codes of conduct agreed upon by the crew, even included stipulations about keeping weapons clean and ready. While this was primarily for combat effectiveness, it hints at a broader, if rudimentary, understanding that a certain level of order and maintenance was beneficial. If your cutlass deserved care, perhaps your own hide did too occasionally. So, as we delve deeper into the nitty-gritty of pirate life, prepare to have some of those ingrained images challenged. We're not suggesting they were paragons of cleanliness, but we are going to uncover some of the unexpected, sometimes surprisingly meticulous, and often downright resourceful grooming habits that these legendary rogues of the sea might have practiced to keep themselves just a little bit more human, a little bit more presentable, or at the very least, a little less likely to succumb to something truly unpleasant before a cannonball or the hangman's noose found them. The story of pirate grooming is a story of adaptation, of making do, and of a certain rugged, almost accidental form of self-care against a backdrop of incredible hardship. Section 2. You're standing on that pirate deck, perhaps noticing those small, almost reluctant concessions to cleanliness. And it dawns on you that the biggest hurdle these seaborne rogues faced wasn't a lack of desire to be clean, at least not entirely, but a profound scarcity of the most basic ingredient for it: fresh water. On any sailing ship during the golden age of piracy, and indeed for centuries before and after, fresh water was a fiercely guarded, strictly rationed, and incredibly precious commodity. Its primary purpose by necessity was for drinking and cooking. Without enough fresh water to drink, a crew would quickly succumb to dehydration, weakness, and eventually death, long before they had a chance to worry about whether their bandana was looking a bit off-white. This life-sustaining liquid was typically stored in wooden casks below deck. Now imagine these casks jostling in the hold for weeks, sometimes months in the tropical heat. The water inside wouldn't stay pristine for long. It could become slimy, develop a rather unfortunate bouquet, and often hosted a lively population of algae and various tiny, uninvited swimming things. Wigglies, as sailors sometimes called them. This water, often tasting more of old wood and despair than actual refreshment, often had far more character than you'd strictly prefer in a beverage. Sometimes a tot of rum or beer was added, not just for morale, but in the vain hope of making it slightly more palatable, or even optimistically killing off some of the less welcome inhabitants. So the idea of generously splashing this vital, if somewhat dubious fluid over your body for a daily bath was for the average pirate pure fantasy. When a pirate did get a chance to bathe, it was almost invariably with salt water dipped straight from the ocean that was their vast shared bathtub. You might see a few crew members during a calm spell sloshing buckets of seawater over themselves on deck, the sun beating down. Or if the ship was becalmed in warm, clear waters, and crucially, if there were no telltale fins circling nearby, they might leap overboard for a quick, invigorating swim. This sounds refreshing, and it probably was momentarily. But a saltwater bath comes with its own set of drawbacks. The salt crystals left behind as the water evaporates on your skin can be incredibly drying and irritating, leading to chafing and itching, especially under rough clothing. It doesn't really get you clean in the modern sense. You might feel less sweaty, but you'd also feel distinctly sticky, like a human salt lick. It definitely left you feeling less refreshed and more lightly pickled. The frequency and methods of full-body personal washing by common sailors and pirates, beyond these anecdotal accounts of swimming or deck bucket dousings, and how these practices might have varied between different crews. The length of the voyage or a ship's immediate water situation, say after a recent stop at a freshwater source, remains somewhat speculative for maritime historians. There weren't exactly detailed hygiene logs kept alongside the ship's manifest of plundered goods. So what did they do when fresh water was out of the question, and even a saltwater dip wasn't practical? Well, necessity is the mother of some rather creative, if not entirely effective solutions. A dry wash, rubbing oneself down with a coarse piece of cloth to remove surface grime and sweat, was likely common. Some accounts from the Age of Sail mention sailors using sand when ashore as an abrasive scrub before rinsing in the sea. Not exactly a gentle exfoliation, but it might shift some of the more stubborn layers of dirt and dead skin. Rainfall was a godsend. When a tropical downpour occurred, you can bet every available container, and quite a few pirates themselves would be out on deck trying to catch the precious fresh water. Sails might be angled to funnel rainwater into barrels. Awnings would become makeshift collectors, and standing under that downpour, letting it sluice away weeks of accumulated salt and grime, would have felt like the ultimate luxury, a genuine gift from the heavens. A truly desperate pirate finding himself with an unbearable itch, or just feeling generally unpleasant and with no fresh water or rain in sight, might have been seen surreptitiously rubbing a handful of damp seaweed over his skin. Imagine the scene: a briny, slightly slimy, but perhaps momentarily cooling and cleansing experience. Not exactly a trip to a Dead Sea mud spa, but needs must when the barnacles are practically blooming on your back from the constant damp and salt. The officers, like the captain or the quartermaster, might have had slightly better, though still limited, access to fresh water. They might have been allocated a small extra ration that could be used for a quick wash of the face and hands, helping them maintain a modicum of distinction from the rank and file. But even for them, true thorough bathing with fresh water would have been an infrequent luxury, probably reserved for those glorious occasions when the ship made landfall near a clean spring or river. The relentless scarcity of fresh water was a fundamental reality that shaped every aspect of life at sea and certainly dictated the often minimal and very salty approach to personal hygiene for the average pirate. You're still feeling that phantom stickiness from a hypothetical saltwater dip, the best a pirate could often hope for in terms of a refreshing bath. Now imagine what that constant exposure to salt sun and a distinct lack of freshwater rinsing did to their hair and beards. The iconic image of a Golden Age pirate often includes a cascade of long flowing locks, perhaps a dramatically untamed beard, all contributing to that rugged devil-may-care persona. And indeed, long hair for men was quite fashionable during the late 17th and early 18th centuries, both ashore and by extension at sea. Plus, with no convenient barbershops dotting the Caribbean waves letting it grow, was often the path of least resistance. A good thatch of hair could also offer some protection from the relentless tropical sun on the scalp and neck. But the reality of maintaining those luscious locks or formidable beards aboard a cramped, constantly moving and hygienically challenged pirate ship was, to put it mildly, a tangled affair. That same salt water that left your skin feeling like a poorly preserved pickle did no favors for hair. It would leave it stiff, coarse, incredibly dry, and prone to epic-level tangles that could probably snag a small seabird. Add to that the general lack of washing with any kind of cleansing agent, and you'd get a buildup of natural oils, sweat dirt, and whatever else happened to be flying around in the salty air. Perhaps a bit of tar fish scales or biscuit crumbs. And then there were the uninvited guests. Yes, we have to talk about them lice. Head lice and body lice were an inescapable part of life on almost any sailing ship of that era, not just pirate vessels. The close quarters, the infrequent changes of clothes, the shared bedding, if you were lucky enough to have any, and the general impossibility of maintaining modern standards of hygiene created a perfect breeding ground for these tiny, unwelcome cabin mates who steadfastly refused to pay rent or contribute to the rum fund. The constant itching and irritation would have been a maddening distraction, a low-level torture accompanying the already considerable discomforts of life at sea. So, what was a self-respecting or even mildly self-aware buccaneer to do about this hairy, itchy situation, hair care? As we know, it was obviously not on the agenda. No beautifully scented shampoos, no silken conditioners, no high-tech detangling sprays. But they weren't entirely without recourse, however rudimentary. A comb, if a pirate possessed one, would have been a prized tool. These could be made of wood or bone, perhaps carved during long idle hours at sea. For the more fortunate pirate one who'd had a good run of plunder, a comb might even be made of ivory or silver lifted from a wealthy merchant ship. The primary goal of combing wouldn't be styling so much as a desperate attempt to remove knots, evict some of the more sluggish lice, and get some air to the scalp. Tying back long hair was almost certainly a common practice, especially during strenuous work, like hauling ropes, climbing rigging, or engaging in a bit of enthusiastic swordplay. A simple leather thong, a strip of cloth, perhaps a colorful looted ribbon, or the ever-versatile bandana would keep hair out of the eyes and to some extent contained. This could also marginally help with lice control by limiting its spread and making the hair a less inviting habitat. Whether certain elaborate hairstyles, such as intricately braided beards like those famously attributed to Blackbeard, or carefully coiffed long hair, occasionally seen in some romanticized pirate depictions, were a practical reality for working pirates on long voyages, or more the product of artistic license and the vanity displayed. During more relaxed periods ashore is a point of discussion among costume historians and maritime researchers. For most, just keeping it from becoming a single solid mat was probably achievement, even enough. To combat the dryness and attempt to manage the unruly mess, pirates might have resorted to using whatever oils or greases were on hand. This could be animal fat saved from cooking fish oil, which would have lent a particularly pungent aroma to an already fragrant individual. Or, if they were lucky, plundered pomades, scented oils, or even barrels of olive oil from a captured vessel. A pirate desperate to tame his wild, salt-caked mane, and with a surprising stroke of luck in recent plunder, might have experimented with using a dollop of stolen, heavily perfumed pomade meant for a wealthy merchant's wig. The resulting aroma, a heady mix of French lavender and 3-week-old sea shanty, would certainly have made him memorable, if not entirely pleasant to be downwind of. These oils could help to condition the hair, make it more pliable, and perhaps even offer a very temporary reprieve from dryness, or in the case of thicker greases, potentially smother some of the less agile lice. A rather desperate form of pest control. Beards presented similar challenges. They'd trap food, salt water, and who knows what else. Trimming, if desired, would be done with a sharp knife, a practice requiring a steady hand and a good deal of trust if someone else was wielding the blade. Blackbeard, of course, took beard management to a theatrical extreme, reportedly weaving slow-match fuses, cords soaked in saltpeter used for firing cannons into his immense black beard and lighting them before battle to wreathe his face in smoke, terrifying his opponents. Talk about a smoking hot look. Literally. This was less about grooming and more about psychological warfare, but it certainly made his beard a legendary, if not particularly fragrant accessory. For most, however, simply keeping it from becoming a nesting place for ship's biscuits was the main concern. You've navigated the treacherous territory of pirate hairstyling, or lack thereof, picturing those salt-stiffened locks and the ever-present threat of tiny, unwelcome guests. It was a constant battle against the elements and biology. Now let's move just a little south from the hairline and consider what was happening inside a pirate's mouth. If you thought their hair had it rough, their dental situation was often a full-blown, unending catastrophe. The iconic image of a pirate often includes a missing tooth or two, perhaps a roguish, gappy grin. And in this particular instance, Hollywood and popular culture probably haven't strayed too far from the uncomfortable truth. Forget pearly whites. For a Golden Age Caribbean pirate, just having any whites left at all by a certain age was something of an achievement. The primary culprit, as with so many health woes at sea, was their diet. Imagine the daily menu, heavily salted meat to preserve it. Not for flavor, mind you, and the infamous hardtack biscuit. These weren't your fluffy dinner rolls. Hardtack was a simple, unleavened biscuit baked to rock-like consistency to prevent spoilage on long voyages. It was notorious for being tough enough to break teeth, often infested with weevils, which pirates sometimes joked were an extra source of protein and generally about as appetizing as chewing on a piece of dried timber. It also served as a handy bludgeoning weapon in a pinch, or a very unappetizing paving stone should the need arise. This, combined with the sugary delights of rum, a pirate's staple and often their main source of liquid calories, created a perfect storm for tooth decay and gum disease. Then there was the dreaded scurvy. This debilitating disease, caused by a chronic lack of vitamin C, fresh fruits and vegetables being exceedingly rare on long voyages, had a devastating impact on oral health long before it led to its more infamous symptoms. Gums would become swollen, spongy, and would bleed at the slightest touch. Teeth would loosen in their sockets, eventually falling out with distressing ease. A pirate suffering from advanced scurvy might lose several teeth in a matter of weeks, leaving them with a painfully sore mouth and a significant difficulty eating even the unappetizing fare on offer. Dental health during the golden age of piracy was therefore generally abysmal for these very reasons. So what did a pirate do when their mouth was a source of constant misery? There were no friendly neighborhood dentists sailing the high seas, no convenient clinics in Tortuga offering checkups and cleanings. The ship's surgeon, if the crew was large or fortunate enough to have one, was usually more preoccupied with amputating limbs shattered by cannonballs or stitching up cutlass wounds than with fiddling about with aching teeth. His dental tools, if any, were likely the same terrifying implements he used for everything else. The extent to which pirates or common sailors actively practiced any form of preventative dental care beyond rudimentary attempts at removing food debris or seeking immediate pain relief for toothaches is difficult to ascertain definitively from the limited direct historical records available. Brushing as we know it with toothbrushes and toothpaste was not a common practice for anyone, let alone a pirate, in the early 18th century. However, they weren't entirely without their makeshift methods, however ineffective they might ultimately have been against the onslaught of decay and disease. A simple toothpick, fashioned from a splinter of wood, A sharpened quill or even a fishbone would have been a common sight used to dislodge stubborn bits of salted beef or hardtack from between the teeth. A pirate captain, having plundered a fancy gentleman's elaborate traveling case, might have even come across a silver or ivory toothpick set. While its original owner probably used it delicately after consuming fine patisserie, our pirate might have employed it more as a fearsome dental excavation tool after a particularly grisly meal, or perhaps even found it surprisingly effective as an earwax remover in a quiet moment. Versatility, after all, was key to a pirate's toolkit. Rubbing the teeth with a piece of rough cloth, perhaps dipped in salt water, might have been another attempt to achieve some level of cleanliness, providing a basic scouring action. Rinsing the mouth with salt water could also have offered a mild antiseptic effect and might have temporarily soothed sore gums. Some traditional folk remedies might have been known, such as chewing on certain leaves or bark, believed to have cleansing or pain-relieving properties, though the efficacy of these is highly debatable. When toothache struck, as it inevitably and frequently did, the primary goal was pain relief. Copious amounts of rum could certainly help numb the throbbing both locally and generally. If they were lucky enough to plunder spices, cloves were a well-known traditional remedy for toothache due to the eugenol they contain, which has antiseptic and analgesic properties. A pirate might have chewed on a clove or tried to pack it around the offending tooth. Ultimately, however, the most common cure for a persistently painful or rotten tooth was extraction. This would be a brutal affair, often performed by the ship's cook or carpenter or any crewmate deemed to have a strong stomach and a reasonably steady hand. The tool could be a pair of pliers from the ship's stores, a modified bit of metal, or anything that could get a grip. There was no anesthetic save perhaps a very large gulp of rum for the patient, and probably the dentist too. The process would have been excruciating, and the risk of infection afterwards immense. Their smiles might not have been dazzling, but they were certainly memorable. And if a few front teeth were missing, their pronouncements were probably delivered with a distinctive whistle. The image of the gap-toothed pirate, therefore, is one rooted firmly in the grim reality of their dental destiny. You've just winced your way through the rather grim realities of pirate dental care, or perhaps more accurately, the profound lack thereof. The image of a gap-toothed, rum-soaked grin is probably quite vivid in your mind right now. So let's move on from the horrors within the pirate mouth to the vast exposed landscape of their skin. If their teeth were under constant siege from a questionable diet and non-existent hygiene, their skin was engaged in a daily full-frontal assault from the relentless Caribbean elements, the blazing sun, the corrosive salt, and the whipping wind. Picture yourself on the deck of that pirate ship day after day under the unfiltered tropical sun. There's no convenient SPF 50 to slather on, no wide-brimmed designer sun hats, no air-conditioned cabin to retreat into. The sun in the Caribbean is a formidable foe, its rays amplified by the reflective glare from the ocean's surface. Sunburn wouldn't just be an occasional holiday inconvenience, it would be a frequent painful reality. Peeling skin blisters, and eventually that deeply weathered, leathery look that we associate with old sailors. Their skin literally baked and cured by years of exposure. Their faces and hands constantly exposed would indeed have more character lines than a particularly dramatic Shakespearean tragedy. And it wasn't just the sun. Remember those saltwater baths we talked about? While perhaps briefly cooling, the salt left behind would draw moisture out of the skin, leaving it dry, cracked, and itchy. The constant wind would further chap and irritate any exposed areas. Then there's the chafing. Rough, salt-stiffened clothing combined with the friction from hauling ropes, scrubbing decks, or simply moving about a constantly swaying ship would lead to painful sores and raw patches, especially in all the places you really wouldn't want them. Sailors during the Age of Sail and pirates were no exception. Frequently suffered from a delightful collection of skin ailments, including these salt sores, severe sunburn, persistent windburn, and even contact dermatitis from handling materials like tar. So what did our resourceful, if often misguided, buccaneer do to protect or soothe his tormented hide? Skin care, in the modern sense, was, of course, unthinkable. No delicately scented lotions, no soothing aloe vera gels conveniently packaged. Their solutions were, as with most things, rough-ready and dictated by what was immediately available. The first and most obvious line of defense was clothing. While the heat might tempt one to strip down, experienced sailors would know the value of covering up. Long-sleeve shirts, if they had them and could bear the extra warmth, would offer some protection. A bandana or a strip of cloth tied around the head could keep the sun off the scalp and forehead. A hat, if one was owned or plundered, was a prized possession for its shade-giving properties. Then there's tar. That sticky black water-resistant substance was essential for maintaining the ship's seaworthiness used to seal timbers and waterproof ropes. It would inevitably get on the sailors' hands and clothes. While tar offered excellent waterproofing for wood, it wasn't exactly going to win any awards from beauty bloggers as a skincare ingredient. In fact, it could be a harsh irritant. However, in a pinch, a small dab of tar might have been seen as a crude way to cover a persistent sore, or a small cut forming a sort of unhygienic waterproof seal. More likely to invite infection than healing, but desperate times often led to desperate, ill-advised measures. More beneficially, perhaps, were any oils or greases they could get their hands on. Animal fat skimmed from the cook's potfish oil, though the aroma would be a significant downside, or plundered olive oil or other vegetable oils might be smeared onto chapped lips, cracked hands, or sunburnt shoulders. These would provide a temporary barrier against the elements and could help to soften and moisturize parched skin, even if they also made the pirate smell like a walking fish fry or a badly maintained lamp. A pirate with a particularly nasty sunburn, having run out of more sensible options or perhaps never having had any to begin with, might have tried slathering his afflicted skin with leftover cooking grease or even a bit of softened candle tallow. The immediate soothing sensation of something cool and greasy was probably quickly replaced by the rather uncomfortable feeling of being a well-basted, slow-roasting piece of meat, attracting every curious fly in a 3-mile radius. Not exactly a recipe for restful slumber. Whether sailors, including pirates, consciously used certain other substances like diluted vinegar, which might have been available for preserving food, or specific plant extracts they encountered in the Caribbean islands as rudimentary sunblocks or after-sun treatments. Or if any protective or soothing effect was purely incidental or based on quickly learned, often painful trial and error, is an ongoing discussion among maritime historians and ethnobotanists. There was a vast pharmacopoeia of traditional plant-based remedies among the indigenous populations and enslaved Africans in the Caribbean. But how much of this knowledge filtered through to or was adopted by the average pirate crew is difficult to say. Ultimately, the pirate's skin told the story of his life tanned to the color of old leather, by the sun etched with fine lines from squinting against the glare, scarred from battles and accidents, and toughened by constant exposure to the harsh realities of a life lived on the unforgiving sea. It was a roadmap of hardship resilience and perhaps a few ill-advised attempts at self-medication with whatever came to hand. You're probably still feeling a phantom itch from imagining the pirate's sun-baked, salt-encrusted skin, perhaps with a lingering whiff of fish oil or rancid tallow used as a makeshift moisturizer. Their skins certainly took a beating. And a significant contributor to that irritation, beyond the direct assault of the elements, would have been their very clothes. Stiff with salt, often damp, and rarely subjected to what we'd recognize as a proper wash. A pirate's attire could be a source of constant chafing discomfort. So what did they do about it? Did these swashbuckling sea dogs ever actually do their laundry? Well, yes, in their own rugged makeshift way, but banish any thoughts of neatly organized laundry days with whirring machines and sweet-smelling detergents? A pirate's wardrobe was famously limited. Most common sailors and pirates were essentially sailors, operating under a different business model. Owned very little in the way of clothing, often just the garments on their back, and perhaps one spare shirt or pair of breeches if they were fortunate. These clothes, typically made of durable but rough materials like canvas coarse wool for cooler weather, or linen if they'd plundered well, were expected to last. Make and mend days were a feature of naval life where time was set aside for sailors to repair their own clothing and gear, and it's highly likely pirate crews adopted similar routines. A stitch in time saved 9, especially when your next chance to acquire a new shirt might involve facing cannon fire. When it came to washing these precious few garments, the ever-present scarcity of fresh water dictated the method. Just as with personal bathing, fresh water was far too valuable to be squandered on laundry. So the ocean itself became their washing machine. One common method for sailors to clean their clothes was to tie them securely with a rope, perhaps bundled into a canvas bag or an old net, and then tow them overboard behind the ship for several hours. The constant drag through the seawater would, in theory, agitate the clothes and dislodge some of the surface dirt sweat. and with any luck, a few of the more tenacious lice or fleas. A pirate might even try to freshen a particularly rank shirt by effectively keel-hauling it. Not the pirate, mind you, but the shirt. Dragging it vigorously through the churning seawater under the ship was thought to dislodge both accumulated grime and any small marine life that might have optimistically taken up residence. Results and indeed shirt survival rates from such robust treatment probably varied considerably. Alternatively, if the weather was calm enough, they might scrub their clothes in a bucket of seawater on deck, perhaps using a stiff brush if one was available or simply by pounding and rubbing the fabric against itself. Soap as we know it was a luxury. While some basic harsh lye soaps were made ashore, it's unlikely that pirate ships carried a regular supply for general laundry. If any soap was used, it was probably plundered along with finer goods and would be used sparingly. Mostly it was just salt water and elbow grease. And as anyone who's tried to wash greasy hands in cold seawater can attest, it's not particularly effective at cutting through oily grime. The resulting garments, once cleaned, would still feel stiff from the salt residue and carry the distinct, not entirely unpleasant, but certainly not spring-fresh aroma of the ocean. Essence of brine shrimp, with a hint of despair perhaps. Drying these saltwater-drenched clothes presented its own set of challenges. The most common method was to hang them in the ship's rigging, the complex network of ropes and spars supporting the masts and sails. You'd see shirts, breeches, and bandanas fluttering like impromptu signal flags, hopefully tied on securely enough not to be claimed by a sudden gust of wind and offered as an unintentional sacrifice to Neptune. However, in the humid Caribbean air and with the constant spray from the waves, clothes rarely ever felt truly bone dry. They'd often remain stubbornly damp, which, as you can imagine, contributed to that lovely mildewy smell and the general discomfort of wearing them. Mildew in some circles was probably the new black, or rather the new greenish-black depending on the particular strain taking hold. The degree to which specific pirate articles or informal shipboard routines explicitly mandated or organized collective laundry efforts versus such tasks being left entirely to individual initiative and opportunity is not always clear from surviving historical sources. It was likely a mix with some basic expectation of not being utterly offensive to one's crewmates, but largely a personal responsibility. Of course, there was some benefit to these efforts, however rudimentary. Washing even in salt water would remove some of the sweat and surface grime, potentially reducing skin irritation. It might also temporarily dislodge some of those ever-present body lice and fleas, offering a brief respite from their relentless attentions. And psychologically, even the illusion of cleaner clothes could provide a small but significant boost to morale in an otherwise challenging existence. The real laundry bonanza came during shore leave. If pirates managed to find a safe haven in a port town or even a secluded cove with a freshwater spring, this was their golden opportunity for a more thorough cleaning. Here they might have access to fresh water, perhaps even be able to trade for or purchase some crude soap. Often local women in port towns made a living by doing laundry for sailors, and pirates with coin to spare would eagerly avail themselves of such services, finally getting their garments free of salt, truly clean, and perhaps even smelling faintly of something other than the deep sea. For a brief time at least, they could escape the tyranny of the salty suds and the ever-present damp. You've just mentally hung out a pirate's meager laundry in the salty rigging, imagining those clothes achieving a state of cleanish that still carried the distinct briny perfume of the deep sea, perhaps with a lingering hint of mildew for character. That unique aroma, a blend of ocean-old sweat and damp fabric, was just one note in the complex olfactory symphony of a pirate ship. Now imagine layered incongruously on top of this rather robust baseline, the delicate, expensive scent of stolen French perfume. It's a jarring thought, isn't it? Yet for the successful pirate, plundered luxuries often included just such fragrant treasures. Before we dabble in these exotic scents, let's just briefly acknowledge the everyday aromatic landscape you as a visitor on this pirate vessel would be navigating. It wasn't by and large a field of roses. There was the pervasive damp woody smell of the ship itself, the ever-present tang of tar used for waterproofing, and the delightful bouquet of bilge water sloshing in the lowest part of the hull. A fragrant soup of seawater leakage and miscellaneous forgotten debris. Add to this the aroma of unwashed bodies in close quarters. The smoke from the galley fire when in use, the faint but persistent smell of livestock. If any chickens or goats were kept aboard, the less than fresh scent of stored provisions, the acrid bite of gunpowder residue after a battle, and of course the sweet, heavy fumes of spilt rum and tobacco smoke. It was, shall we say, an environment with a very distinct and multifaceted personality. Your nose wouldn't know whether to be delighted or deeply concerned from one moment to the next. Into this rich tapestry of pongs, enter the pirates fresh from a successful raid on a merchant ship laden with goods bound for wealthy colonial customers. Among the silks, silver, and spices, they might find crates containing perfumes, scented waters, fragrant pomades for hair and wigs, and even perfumed soaps. These were incredibly valuable luxury items in the 17th and 18th centuries. Scents like rosewater, lavender water, orange blossom water, and more potent animalic fragrances derived from musk. Civet, a secretion from the civet cat surprisingly popular, and ambergris, a waxy substance from sperm. Whales worth more than its weight in gold were all the rage among the fashionable elite in Europe and the Americas. Now, why would a rugged, sea-hardened pirate, presumably more interested in pieces of eight than potpourri, bother with such fripperies? The motivations were likely as varied as the pirates themselves. The most obvious reason, of course, was to attempt to mask the less delightful odors clinging to their person or their immediate surroundings. A generous splash of plundered perfume might not entirely defeat the ingrained scent of old sweat and salt water, but it could perhaps offer a temporary olfactory truce, making one slightly more bearable to be around, or at least making oneself feel slightly more bearable to oneself. Then there was the sheer pleasure of it, the novelty and luxury. These were men and a few women who lived harsh, often brutal lives. To suddenly possess something so rare, so expensive, so undeniably pleasant to the senses was a tangible symbol of their success, a way to enjoy the spoils of their dangerous trade. It was a fleeting taste of the refined world they were in essence preying upon. Whether the average pirate distinguished between the subtle notes of various fine European fragrances, discerning the difference between a Grasse jasmine and a Damascus rose, or simply valued them for their sheer potency, exoticism and ability to temporarily overpower less desirable shipboard aromas is a matter of conjecture among social historians. It's likely the latter for most. Strong and smells nice was probably the main criterion. And, of course, there was the practical consideration of social encounters ashore. When pirates swaggered into port towns like Port Royal or Tortuga, pockets jingling with plundered coin and hearts set on revelry, a dash of fine perfume might have been seen as an essential aid in attracting companionship for the evening. It was an attempt to shed the grime and grit of the sea and present a slightly more appealing, if still intimidating persona. You can imagine the application wasn't always done with the delicate, behind-the-ears dab of a fine lady. More likely, it was a hearty splash, a liberal dousing on clothes, bandanas, perhaps even into a freshly combed or finger-raked beard. The result would be an intriguing, if somewhat confusing, aromatic signature, Eau de Barnacle No. 5, perhaps with a dominant top note of plundered rosewater layered over a robust base of sea salt tar and questionable laundry. A pirate might even develop a particular fondness for a stolen lady's lace handkerchief. Not for its daintiness or inherent value, but because it retained a faint, exquisite perfume from its former owner. You can picture him in a quiet moment, perhaps after a few too many rums, occasionally sniffing it like a precious, fragrant memory of a more refined world, or maybe just to briefly forget the pervasive smell of his less than fragrant crewmates snoring nearby. Some particularly enthusiastic or olfactorily challenged pirates, after capturing a very rich haul of scented goods, might have even humorously or perhaps desperately tried to use perfumed water to freshen particularly pungent areas of the ship itself, like splashing it around a stale cabin or even giving a favored cannon a quick spritz. The results were predictably temporary and probably more comical than effective, but it speaks to the universal human desire for a pleasant smell even amidst the general chaos and grime of a pirate's life. You've just had a rather potent whiff of a pirate ship's complex aromatic profile, where the faint, luxurious scent of plundered French perfume does valiant battle against the more robust, established pongs of bilge, water tar, and unwashed humanity. It's a fragrant battlefield, to be sure. Now, having considered what pirates smelled like, let's turn our attention to the tools they might have employed for any personal upkeep beyond a splash of stolen scent. Given the lack of dedicated grooming kits being standard issue on the Jolly Roger pirates, had to be resourceful, often repurposing the very instruments of their trade for more personal, if somewhat crude, ministrations. And the most ubiquitous, indispensable tool for any pirate, more constant even than their rum ration, was their knife. Every self-respecting buccaneer, from the greenest powder monkey to the most fearsome captain, would have carried at least one knife or dagger. These weren't just for show or for intimidating customs officials. Knives such as sturdy sheath knives, dirks, or clasp knives were absolutely essential for a myriad of daily tasks aboard ship. You'd use your knife for cutting tough salted meat at mealtimes, for slicing through tangled ropes in a storm, for mending sails or fishing nets, for carving a makeshift replacement for a lost button, and of course for close quarters combat when boarding an enemy vessel. A pirate's knife was an extension of his hand, kept sharp as a matter of practical necessity and survival. Today's fish gutter, tomorrow's splinter remover, and occasionally, in a real pinch, a surprisingly effective back scratcher for that one spot you just can't reach. Given its constant presence and sharpness, it's hardly surprising that this all-purpose blade might have been pressed into service for some rudimentary grooming. Let's start with the hands. After days of hauling terry ropes, handling rusty cannons, and generally mucking about, a pirate's fingernails would be in a sorry state, caked with grime, broken, and probably housing their own miniature ecosystems. The sharp tip of a knife would be the obvious tool for scraping out the accumulated dirt from under the nails. Perhaps a particularly fastidious pirate might even attempt to crudely trim or shape a ragged nail with his blade, though it's more likely that biting them down was the common, if less elegant, solution. You certainly wouldn't be asking for a French tip with this kind of manicure. The main goal was just to keep all 10 digits mostly attached and functional. Then there's hair and beards, which we've already established, were often long and unruly. While scissors were not standard personal kit for most, a very sharp knife wielded with extreme caution, or perhaps by a trusted shipmate with a steadier hand, after a few rums could be used for a rough trim. Imagine trying to even out your beard, or lop off split ends with a dagger. It would require intense concentration and a high tolerance for accidental nicks. Shaving one's entire face with such an instrument would be a truly daring feat bordering on performance art, and probably resulting in more bloodshed than a minor skirmish. Proper straight razors existed, but they were specialized tools of barbers, not typically found in a common pirate's sea chest. If a pirate truly desired a clean shave, he'd likely wait until he was ashore and could visit a barber. However, for minor trimming of a mustache, or tidying up the edges of a beard, a keen blade might just have sufficed with a prayer to whichever saint oversaw an unslashed throat. The line between grooming and crude first aid also blurred considerably when a knife was involved. A sharp point was perfect for digging out a stubborn splinter embedded in a hand or foot. In the absence of a ship's surgeon, or if the surgeon was busy elsewhere sawing off someone's leg, a pirate might use his own knife to lance a painful boil or cut away dead or damaged skin from a minor wound. All without the benefit of antiseptic or anesthetic naturally. And as we touched upon before, the tip of a knife could serve as a very robust, if somewhat intimidating toothpick for dislodging a particularly tenacious piece of hardtack. How commonly individual pirates carried specialized small tools intended for personal upkeep, such as dedicated tweezers for plucking stray hairs or small purpose-made scissors for trimming beyond their all-purpose knives. And perhaps a sewing needle for mending is not extensively documented and remains a subject of speculation based on general sailors' practices of the era and rare archaeological finds from shipwrecks. For most, the knife was the Swiss Army knife of its day, expected to perform a multitude of tasks, including those we might now assign to a whole bathroom cabinet of implements. There are even anecdotal or speculative suggestions of more creative, if less hygienic, uses. A resourceful pirate keen to look a bit more put together before a trip ashore might have used the slightly rounded, unsharpened back of his knife blade, or perhaps a conveniently flat and polished piece of plundered metal like a spoon handle to try and smooth down unruly eyebrows, or even attempt to press a semblance of a crease into a much-abused bandana or neckerchief. Not exactly ironing, but an attempt at order nonetheless. It's all about making the best of what you have, even if what you have is primarily designed for less delicate operations. The dandy pirate therefore wielded his dagger not just with menace, but with a surprising, if rather rough-edged attention to the finer details of his rugged appearance. You've just witnessed the pirate's humble knife transform into a surprisingly versatile, if somewhat terrifying, multi-tool for personal upkeep, from impromptu manicures to amateur splinter surgery. It was all about making do with what was at hand. But when it came to their appearance, pirates weren't always limited to the purely practical or the grimly utilitarian. Thanks to their chosen profession of aggressively involuntary wealth redistribution, they often had access to a veritable treasure trove of fine clothing and accessories. And many of them, particularly the captains and more flamboyant characters, thoroughly enjoyed playing dress-up with their ill-gotten gains, creating what you might call the captain's catwalk couture. Forget the Hollywood stereotype of every pirate being perpetually clad in identical tattered rags. While their everyday working attire was undoubtedly durable and probably patched multiple times a successful raid, on a merchant vessel could yield chests overflowing with the latest fashions. From London or Paris, bound for wealthy colonial governors, plantation owners, or merchants. We're talking rich silks, plush velvets, intricately embroidered waistcoats, coats adorned with gold or silver lace, fine linen shirts with frilly cuffs and cravats, feathered hats, and elegant buckled shoes. These were the status symbols of the very gentry the pirates so often despised, and the temptation to appropriate them was for many irresistible. Why would these rough-and-tumble sea dogs bother with such finery, especially given the impracticality of wearing delicate silks while swabbing decks or climbing rigging? The motivations were as varied as the pirates themselves. For some, especially captains and officers, it was a powerful statement of authority and success. Accounts from the golden age of piracy describe notable figures like Bartholomew Black Bart Roberts deliberately cultivating an image of flamboyant command. He was known to enter battle dressed in a rich crimson damask waistcoat and breeches, a diamond-encrusted cross on a gold chain around his neck, a sword in his hand, and pistols tucked into a silk sash. This wasn't just personal vanity. It was a performance, a way to inspire his own crew and intimidate his victims. A well-dressed captain looked like a winner, someone capable of leading them to more plunder. The extent to which the flamboyant dress, adopted by some prominent pirate captains, was a calculated theatrical tool for projecting command, instilling fear in victims, and maintaining crew loyalty through an image of success versus it being primarily an expression of personal vanity and a desire to revel in newfound wealth, is often debated by historians interpreting contemporary accounts. It was likely a potent cocktail of both. For others, wearing these luxurious items was a form of gleeful rebellion, a defiant nose-thumbing at the established social order. To deck themselves out in the finery of the aristocrats and wealthy merchants they preyed upon was a very visible way of saying, "Look at me, I take what I want, and I can be as grand as any of you." There was also undoubtedly the simple human pleasure of wearing something beautiful and comfortable, a stark contrast to their usual rough, salt-stiffened garb. Imagine the feel of soft silk against skin accustomed to coarse canvas. It must have felt like a kingly indulgence. Of course, these fine clothes wouldn't remain pristine for long on a working pirate ship. The silks would snag, the lace would tear, the velvets would get stained with tar rum, or worse. So, such high-fashion items were probably reserved for special occasions celebrating a successful capture, parleying with other captains, or even with their victims for maximum psychological effect, or most commonly for swaggering ashore in a welcoming port ready to spend their loot and impress the locals. Those elegant buckled shoes, for instance, were great for making a statement in a tavern, but decidedly less great for maintaining your footing on a slippery rolling deck. You'd be more likely to trip into the scuppers than cut a dashing figure. The result was often a unique, eclectic, and sometimes downright bizarre style. A pirate might pair a magnificent brocade coat, plundered from a governor's baggage, with his own sturdy, tar-stained canvas trousers, and bare feet. He might wear a fine lace cravat with a grimy, sweat-stained shirt. It was less about a coordinated ensemble and more about adorning oneself with everything valuable or eye-catching that came to hand, sometimes all at once. Pause. Imagine a fierce pirate captain, after a particularly fruitful raid, deciding that a captured nobleman's heavily powdered wig was just the thing to complete his ensemble. Worn slightly askew, perhaps, with a few stray wood shavings from the last tavern brawl still clinging to its pristine white curls. Practical, not in the slightest. Intimidatingly absurd, and a clear sign he was not to be trifled with. Absolutely. Jewelry was another key component of this pirate couture. gold and silver rings often on multiple fingers, heavy earrings believed by some sailors to improve eyesight, though more likely just for show necklaces of plundered pearls or gold coins, and ornate buckles for belts and shoes, all added to the flamboyant image. These weren't just decorative, they were also portable wealth easily carried, and if necessary, easily traded or gambled away. So while the day-to-day reality for most pirates was about practical, durable clothing, the dream often realized through plunder was to emulate and even outdo the very people they fought against, transforming the ship's deck or a rowdy port tavern into their own personal swaggering catwalk. You've just glimpsed the surprisingly flamboyant side of pirate fashion, where plundered silks and velvets briefly transformed rugged buccaneers into an altogether more dazzling, if somewhat mismatched, kind of rogue. That desire to adorn oneself to project an image was clearly present. But alongside these chosen embellishments, a pirate's appearance was also inevitably shaped by far less glamorous and far more permanent accessories. The scars, stitches, and assorted disfigurements acquired during their perilous careers. These weren't items picked from a captured sea chest, they were etched into their very skin, each one a silent, rugged testament to a life lived on the razor's edge. Life at sea during the golden age of piracy was extraordinarily dangerous, a constant dance with potential injury. Combat was, of course, a primary source. A flash of a cutlass could leave a wicked slash across a face or arm. A musket ball could shatter bone. Splintering wood from a cannonball strike could fly like deadly shrapnel, causing horrific wounds. And it wasn't just battle. Accidents aboard a heaving, rolling ship were commonplace. A fall from the rigging onto the hard deck below, a crush injury from shifting cargo or a loose cannon in a storm, severe burns from mishandling gunpowder or from the galley fire, the opportunities for getting maimed were plentiful. Even off-duty brawls fueled by rum and close quarters could result in more than just a few bruises. When these injuries occurred, medical care was, to put it charitably, rudimentary. If a pirate ship was large or prosperous enough, it might have a surgeon aboard, a man who often learned his trade through brutal apprenticeship in naval warfare. His toolkit would consist of an array of rather terrifying saws, knives, probes, and clamps rarely sterilized beyond a quick wipe. Amputation performed without effective anesthetics, save for a large quantity of rum for the patient and perhaps the surgeon too to steady his nerves. And a leather strap to bite down on was a distressingly common procedure for severely mangled limbs to prevent the almost certain death from gangrene. The ship's surgeon's unofficial motto might well have been, "When in doubt, chop it out, and then let's all have another rum." If no dedicated surgeon was present, the task of patching up the wounded might fall to whoever was deemed most capable or perhaps least squeamish. Often the ship's cook, who was handy with a cleaver, or the carpenter who knew his way around a saw. Stitches, if applied, would be coarse and uneven, done with an ordinary needle and whatever thread was available. A pirate, after a particularly nasty fight, and feeling a strange sense of pride in his survival, might have even insisted on having his fresh stitches sewn with a brightly colored silk thread plundered in a previous raid. Not because it was more hygienic, it almost certainly wasn't, but because it made for a more impressive story later and resulted in a rather fancier, more noticeable scar. Got this beauty taking the royal fortune. He might boast, "See the lovely crimson thread, top quality." Wound dressings were equally makeshift. Tar, that ubiquitous shipboard substance, might be smeared over a wound as a crude sealant. Cobwebs were sometimes applied based on an old belief that they could help stop bleeding. Various herbal poultices, their ingredients and efficacy highly questionable, might also be tried. The concept of antiseptic treatment was centuries away. Infection was a constant, often fatal complication. Yet for those who survived these brutal encounters, and even more brutal treatments, the resulting scars, peg legs, and hooks became indelible parts of their identity. A jagged scar across a cheek, a missing eye covered with a patch, a crudely fashioned wooden leg, or a menacing iron hook where a hand once was. These weren't just marks of past trauma, they evolved into symbols. They told a story of survival, of battles fought, and dangers overcome. They could be badges of honor, unspoken proof of a pirate's experience and fearsomeness. Such visible disfigurements undoubtedly added to their intimidating aura, a useful asset in a profession that relied heavily on projecting terror. Forget politely talking about the weather. "My word, how did you acquire that spectacular scar by?" was probably the ultimate icebreaker in pirate circles. The psychological impact of such disfigurement on pirates, whether it led to increased aggression, a sense of alienation, or perhaps a strengthening of group identity among fellow scarred veterans, and how it precisely affected their social standing within the often brutal hierarchy of a pirate crew or their interactions with outsiders, is an area where historical evidence offers more tantalizing questions than definitive answers. Did a man with a particularly fearsome set of scars command more respect or more fear? Did it make him an outcast or a legend? The grooming of these wounds during the healing process would have been another rough and ready affair. Cleaning might involve a wipe with a rum-soaked rag, the alcohol perhaps offering a slight accidental antiseptic effect along with a considerable sting. Bandages would be strips of old linen or canvas changed infrequently. The smell of a healing wound, or worse, a festering one, would add yet another layer to the already complex aromatic signature of the individual pirate and the ship as a whole. These were not subtle adornments. They were bold, often raw declarations of a life lived hard, a style dictated not by fashion, but by fate and the very sharp edge of survival. You've just recoiled from the grim reality of pirate surgery and the rather permanent, if sometimes celebrated, style of scars and makeshift repairs that adorned many a buccaneer. These were the unavoidable, often brutal marks of their chosen profession. But what happened when these sea-battered, scar-laden individuals finally made landfall in a bustling Caribbean port? Their pockets heavy with plundered coin, after weeks, perhaps months of deprivation danger, and decidedly dodgy hygiene at sea, the allure of port wasn't just about rum and revelry. It was also a precious opportunity for some much-needed, if still rather basic, pampering. Imagine yourself stepping off that cramped, smelly ship onto the relatively solid ground of a place like Port Royal, in its heyday, before the earthquake of 1692 rudely rearranged the real estate, or perhaps the notorious pirate haven of Tortuga. The air, while still carrying the scents of the tropics and the sea, would also be thick with the smells of cooking food. Unfamiliar spices, tobacco, and humanity in all its noisy, vibrant glory. For a pirate fresh off a long voyage, the first craving even before the tavern might well have been for the simple luxury of fresh water and a chance to feel properly clean for the first time in an age. Upon reaching port, pirates with plunder often sought out opportunities to wash away the accumulated grime of the sea. The extent to which dedicated public bathhouses offering hot water and private tubs as opposed to more informal private arrangements in lodgings, or simply utilizing natural freshwater sources like rivers or springs were commonly available and regularly frequented by the average pirate in specific Caribbean ports during the Golden Age, is not always clearly detailed in contemporary records, with much evidence being anecdotal. However, any chance to submerge oneself in fresh water, perhaps even with a sliver of precious soap purchased or bartered for, would have felt like a rebirth. The sheer bliss of washing off layers of salt sweat tar and who knows what else would have been a profound sensory experience, a shedding of the literal and figurative dirt of their hard life at sea. Next on the agenda for many a newly landed pirate was a visit to the local barber. In the 17th and 18th centuries, a barber was much more than just a haircutter. These establishments were often run by barber surgeons skilled in wielding sharp blades for a variety of purposes. Here, a pirate could finally get a proper shave. Imagine the relief of having that itchy, salt-caked beard expertly removed with a keen razor in warm water, or at least neatly trimmed and shaped. Long matted hair could be cut, combed through, and perhaps even styled into something resembling the fashion of the day, or at least into something that didn't look like a seabird had recently nested in it. It's even said that some pirates, after a particularly long and arduous voyage, plagued by those tiny, unwelcome hair-dwelling companions, would pay a barber extra just to sit in the chair and have their scalp vigorously, meticulously scratched and deloused with a fine-toothed comb by someone else. The sheer, unadulterated relief being worth more than a few pieces of silver. These multi-talented barbers might also offer to pull an agonizingly rotten tooth, a slightly more professional and perhaps marginally less terrifying experience than having it yanked out by the ship's cook with a pair of rusty pliers. They could also tend to minor wounds, clean up festering sores, or offer other small surgical services. The barber was part hairdresser, part dentist, part minor league surgeon, and probably part gossip columnist too. A true Renaissance man of personal maintenance and local news. With pockets full of plunder, another port day indulgence was acquiring new clothes, or at the very least getting their existing sea-stained garments properly laundered. Local women in port towns often earned a living by washing clothes for sailors, handing over your filthy, salt-stiffened shirt and breeches and getting them back relatively clean. Freshwater rinsed and perhaps even smelling faintly of wood smoke or sunshine instead of stale seawater. And old fish would have been a remarkable transformation. For those with more coin, new garments could be purchased. Perhaps a brightly colored sash, a new linen shirt, or even some of the finer items they hadn't managed to plunder directly. And remember those plundered perfumes and scents we talked about? Port was the place to replenish one's stock or to acquire new exotic fragrances. A pirate flush with his share of the latest prize might splurge on a small vial of highly scented hungry water, a rosemary and alcohol-based concoction, or perhaps some Florida water. A citrus and spice cologne that became popular later but had earlier simpler counterparts from a quayside vendor. Dousing himself liberally in such a fragrance was an attempt to smell like anything other than pickled herring and maritime desperation before heading out for an evening of carousing. This wasn't about achieving a spa day level of zen-like pampering. It was about reclaiming a sense of basic human dignity and comfort, about shedding the animalistic grime of the sea and feeling for a short while like a person of some standing, however ill-gotten that standing might be. It was a transformation from terrifying sea monster to slightly less terrifying and perhaps even pleasantly scented land-based monster, all in the space of a few hours and a handful of silver. You've just witnessed our weather-beaten pirate pockets flush with plundered coin, indulging in the relative luxuries of a Caribbean port town. A fresh water wash, a visit to the multi-talented barber. Perhaps even a new shirt that doesn't smell faintly of despair and old fish. This shore leave wasn't just about carousing, it was a vital chance to reconnect with a semblance of civilization and shed the worst of the sea's grime. And these ports, bustling hubs of trade and humanity, were also incredible melting pots of cultures. This constant exposure to different peoples with their own unique customs and traditions inevitably led to a certain amount of cultural exchange, even in the unlikely realm of grooming habits. Pirate crews themselves were often remarkably diverse, a veritable United Nations of outlaws. While many hailed from Great Britain, France, Holland, and other European maritime nations, their ranks were frequently swelled by individuals of African descent, some formerly enslaved, who sought freedom in a pirate's life, others free men from the outset, as well as indigenous Americans from various Caribbean and mainland communities. You might even find the occasional Scandinavian Italian or Portuguese sailor who had, through choice or circumstance, ended up on the account. This cosmopolitan nature of both the pirate ships and the Caribbean port cities they frequented created a unique environment where ideas, languages, and yes, even grooming tips could be swapped, borrowed, or sometimes just curiously observed. Their approach to cultural exchange was often a bit direct, perhaps along the lines of take their gold and maybe borrow their particularly effective shampoo recipe if it's any good. Imagine a pirate ship with a crew drawn from half a dozen different backgrounds. Each man would bring with him the ingrained habits and folk wisdom of his homeland. A sailor from West Africa might have traditional methods for hair care using palm oil or shea butter, if such ingredients found their way aboard through trade or plunder, or might be familiar with using a chewing stick, a frayed twig from a specific plant, for cleaning teeth, a practice common in many African cultures and arguably more effective than just poking about with a splinter of wood. An indigenous Caribbean crew member might possess knowledge of local plants with soothing or cleansing properties, perhaps knowing which leaves could be crushed to create a lather, or which saps could alleviate the sting of sunburn or insect bites. The extent to which specific grooming techniques or cosmetic uses of natural products from indigenous Caribbean African or even more distant cultures perhaps encountered via plundered East India Company goods like spices or sandalwood were systematically adopted and integrated into common pirate practice among the European majority beyond individual experimentation or the established habits of non-European crew members, is an area where concrete historical evidence is often elusive and relies heavily on anthropological inference. Pirates weren't exactly meticulous ethnographers noting down the origins of their grooming routines. However, pirates were above all pragmatic. If a fellow crewmate, regardless of his origin, had a trick that seemed to work, whether it was a better way to deal with lice, a more effective method for soothing chafed skin, or a way to keep flies at bay, word might spread. Perhaps a pirate, after a particularly friendly or not so friendly exchange with a Mosquito Coast native in Central America, discovered the surprising efficacy of a particular pungent plant rub that kept biting insects at bay far better than his own signature cologne of sweat and rum. He wouldn't understand the intricate botany behind it or care much for its cultural significance, but he'd certainly appreciate the subsequent itch-free evenings and might try to replicate it. If it stopped you itching or smelling quite so much like a deceased manatee that had been left in the sun, it was probably considered worth a try. European pirates themselves would have brought a variety of regional customs. A Frenchman might have different ideas about beard trimming than an Englishman or a Dutchman, a particular way of oiling his sea boots that also found its way onto his chapped hands. In the close confines of a ship, these small personal habits would be visible, and some might be adopted by others if they seemed beneficial or even just novel. Consider, for example, the simple act of using certain types of crushed tree bark or specific leaves known for their natural saponin content, compounds that can create a mild lather, as a makeshift soap substitute when washing clothes or even themselves in fresh water ashore. This was a known practice in many parts of the world, and it's conceivable that pirates learned this trick from indigenous or African acquaintances, providing a bit more cleaning power than fresh water alone when precious soap was unavailable. It wasn't about wholesale adoption of entire cultural grooming repertoires. Rather, it would have been a piecemeal process driven by need curiosity and the simple human tendency to copy something that seems to offer an advantage, however small. A new way to tie a bandana for better sun protection. A different method for storing scarce water to keep it cooler. A particular way of treating a rope burn learned from an old salt who'd sailed different seas. All these small bits of knowledge could contribute to a pirate's comfort and well-being, and by extension, to their grooming in the broadest sense of maintaining their bodies against the harsh environment. The pirate ship, for all its brutality and squalor, was also a floating laboratory of human adaptation and cultural fusion, even in the most personal of habits. You've just wandered through the diverse makeshift world of pirate grooming, where indigenous plant knowledge might have mingled with European sailors' rough habits, all stirred together in the great cosmopolitan cauldron of a pirate ship. It was a testament to adaptation to making do. But not all pirates were content with merely making do when it came to their personal presentation. While the prevailing image is one of grime and rugged disarray, the golden age of piracy also saw its share of buccaneers who were, shall we say, surprisingly attentive to their appearance, cultivating a dandyish flair that sharply contradicted the grubby stereotype. For these particular sea rovers, it was less plunder the gold and more plunder the gold-threaded waistcoat, and then the gold if there's time. These weren't just pirates who managed to keep reasonably clean or occasionally sported a plundered silk sash. We're talking about individuals who by all accounts took a very deliberate and often flamboyant approach to their attire, and perhaps even their grooming, using their appearance as a statement of intent, a badge of success, or simply an indulgence of personal vanity. The most famous and perhaps the most striking example of a dandy pirate is the Welshman Bartholomew Roberts, better known as Black Bart. Despite his rather menacing nickname, which incidentally he likely never used himself, he was more commonly called Le Joli Rouge, or the Pretty Red, by the French possibly for his ruddy complexion or his fine red clothes. Roberts was renowned for his sartorial splendor. Accounts from his time paint a picture of a man who went into battle dressed like he was attending a rather aggressive gala. Imagine him a tall, dark figure commanding his ship, clad in a rich crimson damask waistcoat and breeches, a fine holland shirt, a scarlet feathered hat, a silk sash slung across his shoulder, supporting 2 pairs of pistols, and around his neck a gleaming gold chain adorned with a diamond-encrusted cross, an item reportedly plundered from the Portuguese treasure fleet. This wasn't just a one-off, it was his signature look. Legend has it that Black Bart Roberts was so particular about his appearance that he would sometimes delay an attack if his favorite crimson coat wasn't properly brushed on and aired, or if his ceremonial sword he often carried too needed an extra polish. His enemies, and even his own crew, probably found this commitment to dandyism in the face of imminent bloody battle both utterly terrifying and deeply confusing. It projected an aura of untouchable confidence of a man so in command of his destiny that he had time for sartorial concerns even as cannonballs flew. Whether the meticulous and often extravagant appearance cultivated by certain pirate leaders like Bartholomew Roberts, when it was consistently maintained, Even during the day-to-day privations of long, arduous sea voyages, imagine trying to keep white lace cuffs pristine while navigating a tropical squall, or primarily reserved for dramatic effect during battle parleys with other captains and celebratory port visits, is a subject of some historical speculation based on the interpretation of contemporary, often second-hand accounts. It's likely a bit of both, a natural inclination towards finery amplified for maximum impact when the occasion demanded. He certainly had the means being one of the most successful pirates in history, capturing hundreds of ships. His personal share of the plunder would have afforded him a wardrobe far beyond that of the average sea dog. Then there's the curious case of Stede Bonnet, often dubbed the gentleman pirate. Bonnet came to piracy from a completely different background than most. He was a moderately wealthy plantation owner from Barbados, a man of some education and social standing who, for reasons still debated by historians, a midlife crisis, a desire to escape a nagging wife, pure, inexplicable whim, decided to buy his own ship, hire a crew, and sail off to become a pirate in 1717. Unlike other captains who rose through the ranks or were elected by their peers, Bonnet initially knew very little about sailing or commanding a vessel, which didn't exactly endear him to his more experienced and often mutinous crew. Given his background, it's reasonable to assume Stede Bonnet was accustomed to a certain standard of dress and personal comfort far removed from the usual rough-and-tumble pirate life. He reportedly even had a library of books aboard his ship, the Revenge, suggesting a man with lingering pretensions to refinement. While specific details of his daily grooming are scarce, one can imagine him trying to maintain some semblance of his former gentlemanly appearance, perhaps much to the amusement or irritation of his crew. It's rumored that Bonnet was so unaccustomed to the crude ways of the sea that he sometimes complained to his crew about the uncouth state of the ship or their boisterous manners, perhaps even penning a strongly worded letter to the editor of the imaginary Pirate Ship Etiquette Gazette. His career in piracy was largely disastrous, marked by incompetence and eventual capture and execution. But his image as an unlikely, almost comically out-of-place gentleman pirate certainly stands out. Beyond these more famous examples, other pirates undoubtedly took pride in their appearance when circumstances allowed. A particularly fine plundered hat, a well-oiled pair of leather boots, a silver-buckled belt, or even just a neatly tied neckerchief could elevate a pirate's look from mere ruffian to a slightly more distinguished ruffian. Some might have meticulously cared for their beards or mustaches, trimming them with a plundered razor, or sharp knife, perhaps even attempting a fashionable curl or point with a bit of pomade if they had it. It was all part of constructing an identity in a world where your reputation and how you carried yourself could mean the difference between commanding respect and facing a sudden sharp career change at the hands of a disgruntled crewmate. These dandy buccaneers remind us that even amidst the squalor and brutality, the human desire for self-expression and a touch of elegance could rather unexpectedly find a way to shine. You've just admired the audacious finery of pirate captains like Black Bart Roberts, who transformed plundered silks and jewels into symbols of command and terrifying elegance. It's a striking image that, of a dandy buccaneer meticulously turned out amidst the chaos of a pirate vessel. But now let's zoom out from these individual efforts at sartorial splendor and consider the pervasive, inescapable sensory environment of the ship itself. For no matter how much French perfume a captain might splash on, or how diligently a crewman tried to keep his one spare shirt passably clean, they were all swimming in an olfactory ocean that was uniquely and often overwhelmingly the ship's own signature scent. Sailing ships of the 17th and 18th centuries were notorious for their powerful and complex aromas, and pirate ships often captured merchantmen pressed into harder service with larger crews were certainly no exception. Individual grooming efforts, however valiant or surprisingly refined, were often fighting a losing battle against the sheer olfactory force of their floating wooden world. It was less eau de toilette and more eau de everything you never ever wanted to smell all at once with a hint of tar. At the very top of the list of offenders, the undisputed heavyweight champion of shipboard stinks was the bilge. This lowest part of the ship's hull was the unhappy recipient of all manner of liquid unpleasantness, seawater that seeped through the planks, leakage from casks, be it water, rum, or something far less appealing, spilled food, vomit from seasick sailors, animal waste if livestock was aboard, and quite possibly the decomposing remains of unfortunate rats or other vermin. This fragrant soup would slosh about in the darkness, festering and fermenting, creating a miasma so foul that it could literally take your breath away and was considered a serious health hazard. Periodically, the bilge would be pumped out, but this process often just stirred up the noxious sediment, releasing fresh waves of eye-watering perfume throughout the vessel. Then there was the constant, inescapable smell of tar and oakum, hemp fibers soaked in pine tar, used relentlessly to caulk the seams between the ship's timbers and waterproof the rigging. While essential for keeping the ship afloat, this gave the entire vessel a pungent, slightly acrid, and deeply penetrating aroma that clung to everything woodcloth hair, and probably the souls of the men aboard. The cargo itself, whether legitimate or recently plundered, could add its own unique notes to the aromatic symphony. Spices like cloves or cinnamon, if captured, would provide a brief, delightful counterpoint. But more often, cargoes might include less fragrant items. Animal hides, which if not properly cured could become incredibly rank casks of salted fish or meat, carrying their own robust sea-worn scent or sugar and molasses, which while sweet could also attract vermin and become sticky fermenting messes if casks leaked. And of course there was the human element. Imagine dozens, sometimes over 100 men, crammed into the tight, often poorly ventilated confines of a ship for weeks or months on end. With limited bathing opportunities, relentless physical labor in a hot climate, and a diet heavy on salted, preserved foods, the collective body odor would have been significant. Add to this the smell of unwashed, perpetually damp clothing, the close proximity to the ship's heads, rudimentary toilet facilities, often just a grating or platform at the bow overhanging the sea, and the unfortunate aromas associated with common shipboard illnesses like dysentery or fevers. It's a potent mix. Animals too played their part. Chickens for eggs, goats for milk or meat. Perhaps a pig or two and the ubiquitous ship's cat, essential for rodent control, all contributed their own unique barnyard notes. And speaking of rodents, the rats and mice themselves, a constant presence added their own musky perfume. It's even said with a grim sort of humor that the rats on some ships got so accustomed to the taste of rum from constantly nibbling on soaked cask staves that their own little ratty contributions to the ship's aroma had a distinctly boozy, almost festive undertone. A party no one consciously wanted to attend, but everyone was on the guest list. The lingering smells of gunpowder after a battle sharp and sulphurous would mix with the everyday fug, and the constant haze of tobacco smoke as many sailors were avid smokers or chewers would weave itself into the very fabric of the ship. How pirates and common sailors of the Golden Age subjectively perceived and culturally tolerated this constant and often overwhelming olfactory onslaught, and what precisely constituted an unacceptable or noteworthy level of stench beyond this pervasive norm is difficult for modern sensibilities with our vastly different hygiene standards in air-freshened environments to fully comprehend or reconstruct from historical text. After a few weeks at sea, you probably just assumed the whole world smelled faintly of old socks, damp dog, and a profound sense of regret. Attempts were made to mitigate the worst of it. Besides pumping, the bilge below deck areas might be aired out when weather permitted by opening hatches. Sometimes pitch might be burned or strong-smelling herbs or vinegar sprinkled about in an attempt to sweeten the air, though this was often more about trying to ward off disease miasma theory being prevalent than achieving true freshness. For the most part, however, the signature scent of the ship was an inescapable reality, a constant companion that no amount of plundered perfume could truly banish, only temporarily and often rather bizarrely attempt to mask. You've just been enveloped in the rather potent and inescapable signature scent of a Golden Age pirate ship, a complex olfactory brew that even the most fragrant plunder couldn't entirely vanquish. It was a constant sensory backdrop to their lives. But for many pirates, that life with all its grime glory and unique aromas would eventually lead to a stark and public finale, the gallows. And in this last dramatic act of their often short and turbulent lives, some pirates chose to make a final, carefully considered statement, with their appearance a sort of defiant gallows grooming. The romance of piracy often conveniently overlooks the grim reality that for many, the account closed not with a peaceful retirement on a tropical beach, but with capture, a swift trial, and a date with the hangman. Executions, whether at London's infamous execution dock at low tide or in colonial ports across the Caribbean and North America, were public spectacles designed to deter others from a life of crime on the high seas. The condemned pirate would often be paraded through the streets, a sermon might be preached, and a crowd would gather to witness the ultimate price of piracy. Faced with this inevitable end, many pirates sought to die gamely, as the saying went, bravely, defiantly, and without showing fear. This desire to control their own narrative, even in their final moments, could extend to how they presented themselves. If their captivity allowed for any degree of personal agency, some soon-to-be hanged pirates made efforts to meet their fate with a surprising degree of care. If held in a jail that offered even rudimentary access to water, a pirate might make a last attempt to wash away the accumulated filth of imprisonment, and the lingering grime of the sea a final shedding of their earthly burdens. Then there was the matter of attire. Historical accounts of pirate executions sometimes describe the condemned individuals dressing in their best available clothes. Remember that plundered finery we discuss? A pirate who had managed to secret away a decent shirt, a relatively intact coat, or perhaps a brightly colored sash might choose to wear these for his final public appearance. It wasn't about vanity in the face of death, so much as a refusal to appear broken or wretched. It was a way to face their accusers and the assembled crowd with a semblance of dignity or even a theatrical flourish. If you're going out, you might as well go out looking like you meant to cause all that trouble in the first place. They were ensuring their final review was a good one, even if the critics were mostly seagulls and the hangman himself, a pirate with a particularly well-known scar. One that perhaps told a silent famous story of his daring exploits or a narrow escape might ensure that very scar was prominently visible on his way to the gallows. Not hidden in shame, but worn as a final defiant boast of the life he'd chosen, and the adventures he'd survived up until that point. It became part of his legend, his last indelible mark on the world. The psychological motivations behind a condemned pirate's choice of attire and demeanor at the gallows, whether primarily driven by a deep-seated desire for personal dignity, a calculated act of public defiance against the authority that had condemned them, or perhaps an adherence to an unwritten pirate code of dying well and without fear, are complex and interpreted variously by historians examining the often sensationalized execution narratives. It was likely a potent mix of all these things. If opportunity and means allowed, a pirate might even try a final comb through his hair or beard. There are romanticized tales, though, perhaps with a kernel of truth of pirates going to the gallows with a jaunty ribbon tied in their remaining locks, or a small, bright flower. If such a thing could possibly be procured in the grim confines of a colonial jail, tucked into their coat. These small, poignant acts of bravado, these tiny aesthetic flourishes in the face of oblivion, speak volumes about the human desire to retain some measure of self, some control over one's own presentation, even at the very end. Their final words, often recorded, though sometimes embellished by pamphleteers, were another part of this performance. A bold speech, a defiant curse, a final jest, or even a warning to others all contributed to the image they wished to leave behind. And that image, whether of a dandy in faded silks, a ruggedly scarred veteran, or a simple stoic figure facing death with unblinking eyes, was their last act of grooming, shaping the way they would be remembered if only for a short while in the public consciousness and in the annals of pirate lore. It was the ultimate irreversible makeover. And so our exploration of the unexpected grooming habits of Golden Age Caribbean pirates, a journey that has taken us from the myth of universal grime to the realities of saltwater baths, lousy locks, plundered perfumes, dandy captains, and finally, to the defiant dignity of the gallows, now drifts towards its quiet conclusion. It's a story filled with surprising contrasts, where rugged practicality met occasional vanity, and where the harshest of environments still couldn't entirely extinguish the human desire for some measure of cleanliness, comfort, or self-expression. The creak of the ship's timbers, the snap of the sails, the distant cry of gulls, and even the faint imagined scent of salt and tar mingled with stolen rosewater, all begin to recede now, carried away on the gentle tide of your drowsiness. The vivid images of those buccaneers with their makeshift hygiene and surprising flourishes of style can soften and blur like figures disappearing into a tropical sea mist. The Caribbean sun, which once blazed so fiercely on their weathered skin and plundered finery, now sets in your mind, leaving behind the cool, calm peace of approaching sleep. Let the rough edges of their world smooth away and allow the steady, rhythmic cadence of this tale to guide you into a deeper state of relaxation. There are no more battles to be fought, no more storms to endure, only the gentle rocking of your own quiet breath. The tales of their lives with all their sound and fury now signify a time for rest. Release any lingering thoughts and let the quiet of this moment be your own safe harbor. The adventure is over and a peaceful night awaits.